Thank you for joining today's webcast on federal and state legislation impacting public pensions. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director and Counsel for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote continuing education to pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. Today, we will review state and federal legislation from 2018, then the results of the midterm elections and their potential impact on policy debates surrounding surrounding public pensions in 2019. Joining me today is our regular contributor, Tony Roda, partner at the law and lobbying firm of Williams Jensen. Also joining us is Andrew Collier, Communications Director with the National Public Pension Coalition. Today's format we will begin with a moderated conversation with our two panelists, but we will reserve the last part of the program for your questions. Please submit them by using the GoToMeetings portal. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. And Andrew, I'd like to start with you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
So what I'd like to do is, for the benefit of the audience, do a quick review of where we left off at the middle of July of 2018, and then catch them up through the end of 2018. Are there any notable legislations that were enacted or defeated at the state level in the second half of 2018?
For sure. I think the most notable was definitely in the state of Kentucky. Kentucky always seems to be one of those states that we always end up at. But at the end of the year, Governor Bevin called a special session for the legislature, and within 23 hours, the legislature ended the special session. And the reason he called it was to address pension or funding in the state. And, you know, I think this is about the third time now where this has occurred in Kentucky. So that's essentially the only thing that's happened since the last time that we met in July.
Well, I think on one hand, it's good news, right?
Yeah,
not much
definitely.
to report in the second half is not a bad thing to report.
For sure.
How about you, Tony, at the federal level? And again, let me begin by saying welcome. Thanks again for joining us.
Happy to do it, always happy to do it. And Andrew, I'm happy to be working with you on this. So the second half of an election year of a Congress is generally going to be pretty light, you know, because the members want to be back home campaigning, and that was what occurred in 2018. Congress in general was able to accomplish a couple things that people didn't think they would. One was, it doesn't have anything to do with pensions, but it was the criminal justice reform bill. And that was bipartisan initiative. And then they also did a bipartisan farm bill. So if you look at the Congress, there were achievements in a bipartisan nature. But they did not accomplish funding. And as we see continuing to play out now, in day 18 of the federal shutdown, they were not able to come to any closure with the president on federal funding bills, at least for part of the government, a significant part of the government. There was also, when we last talked, legislation pending on retirement and pension issues, both in the House and in the Senate. While the House did pass a version of legislation they called the Family Savings Act, and that included a provision that was specific to state and local governmental plans on the arcane but very important pickup rule, and on elections between tiers and plans. That provision did pass the House. It was removed in later versions of that same bill. But none of those provisions, and nothing that the Senate had proposed on retirement, which were largely private sector defined contribution proposals, made it to the end zone, to the finish line. So all that has to begin again in this current Congress. And the other item I'll mention is that there was a select committee on multi-employer pension plans. Again, not us, but something we were watching very closely. Private sector workers, collectively bargained plans, and funding shortfalls in about 10% of those plans that are significant. The special select committee was unable to reach any conclusion as to recommendations. So that is also going to be something that will have to be revisited.
Okay, and we can talk a little bit more about that in this, the last third of our program. But So, all right, so I think we caught up our audience in terms of what happened at the state and federal level from middle of July through December. Let's now backtrack a little bit and talk about what happened in November with the midterm elections. Tony, let me start with you.
Sure.
Tell us what happened at the federal level with Congress, and then Andrew, you can tell us what happened at the state level with the legislatures and the governors.
So as we know now, most of the prognosticators were correct. The Senate remained in Republican hands. The seats that were up, the 1/3 of the Senate that was up in 2018, lopsided in favor of the Republicans, very red states, potential pickups. And the Republicans were able to pick up 2 seats and raise their majority to 53-47. So not a surprise. The House, in my view, also not a surprise. There were so many tight races, contested races in suburban districts throughout the country that most observers thought, given the drag on the ticket that the president was giving in those suburban districts, that the House would flip. And indeed the House did. We saw it throughout the country. Some big surprises in certain states like Kansas. Orange County, California, where not a single Republican House member remains in this current Congress, which is really striking. But the new House Democratic majority is at 235 and 199 Republicans. There's 1 seat still outstanding, which we've all probably read about in North Carolina due to allegations of election fraud.
Okay. Andrew, states.
Yep.
What happened?
A lot happened in the states this past year. I think there's 4 big states where retirement security really was a primary issue. What happened in the election. So the first is Oregon. Incumbent governor, Democrat Kate Brown won re-election in that state, defeating Representative Newt Bueller. Not only did Kate Brown win, but Democrats were able to obtain a supermajority in both the House and the Senate in the state. Secondly was Kansas. Tony had just mentioned. That was a major upset for Democrats with Chris Kobach, who is kind of nationally known as a voter suppressor, was defeated by Laura Kelly, a Democrat in the state. Another one was Colorado. If you remember correctly, last year Colorado passed a pension bill, SB 200. Jared Polis, a Democratic representative, defeated Walker Stapleton. And Walker Stapleton, if you remember correctly, he's a state treasurer, but he's also been an anti-pension opponent in the past. So that was a big win. And Democrats also took back the state Senate, and they had the state House previously. And then Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer, she defeated a Republican in that state as well. And Democrats narrowed their minorities in both the House and the Senate there. I think there's also trifecta states that remain Republican trifectas. We have Iowa, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Indiana, Kentucky, Arizona, and Texas, all states where Republicans maintain their trifectas, although Democrats did narrow their field there. And then there's 2 states that I wanted to point out that are still or are now split states. So New Hampshire, the incumbent governor there, who's a Republican, won, but Democrats were able to gain control of both the House and the Senate in that state. And then Pennsylvania, where Governor Tom Wolf defeated a state senator, Scott Wagner, for the governor's office. But because of gerrymandering, the House and the Senate still remain in firm Republican control.
Okay, great. So then looking ahead, we're in 2019. State legislatures are starting to come in session if they haven't started already. Congress has just reconvened. What do you think are the implications of the midterm elections? Andrew, I'll start with you if you want to talk about 1 or 2 implications, and then we'll go over to Tony.
For sure. I think there's about 3 different states where we could see pension legislation attempted to be passed this coming session. The first is Kentucky, always. I think Republicans in that state are a little bit emboldened to try again for a fourth time to pass some sort of legislation, but we'll see.
Yeah.
They seem a little not as organized as they did in the past. And then also Arizona and Texas are both states where Republicans in those states have kind of signaled that they're willing to look at passing some sort of hybrid legislation, which, as we know, would really harm the retirement security of retirees in those states.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tony, here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I don't see much of a honeymoon period between the current Congress, the new Congress, and the president, and I think that's being, whatever period that would be, is being soaked up by the shutdown battle. But, excuse me, I do think on infrastructure that there's a possibility that the Democrats and the Republicans can work together. And that is, of course, very important to the country, very important to the economy. And there have been proposals over the years related to public pensions, a couple that we've worked on recently. So there's, as Hank well knows, and as Hank has been in correspondence with Congressman Yarmouth of Kentucky, who's the new House Budget Committee chairman, the congressman has a proposal yet to be introduced to create a national infrastructure development bank. And that bank, and proposals of this nature have been around for a while. This is an interesting one. That bank would be able to issue $75 billion in Rebuild America bonds right off the bat. Those bonds would have a 40-year maturity. You would need to hold it for 10 years. And the interest rate would be 200 basis points above the Treasury 30-year bond rate. So $75 billion off the bat with a potential for $300 billion additional in bonds to be issued. And for public pension plans, and all pension plans, they are the only eligible purchasers of these bonds, which is a very interesting approach. So plans covered by ERISA, but then public plans as well. Mm-hmm. So it's something I know that you've collected comments from your members on and have been working with the Congressman's office. So we'll see where that goes. But as the chairman of the House Budget Committee, he's certainly in a position to advance his legislation as this process unfolds. There was another piece of legislation on infrastructure related to the tax treatment of bonds where the asset was partially owned or owned by a governmental pension plan. That legislation was introduced by Rob Bishop of Michigan. He did not win re-election. It is unclear at this point whether it will be reintroduced. I think someone will pick up the idea, but we'll see. So there are a couple of pieces on infrastructure that will be potentially very important to state and local plans. And the other area I'll mention is Medicare. Now, Medicare I don't see as an area where the parties are going to come together, and you have a wide spectrum of proposals out there. Medicare for All, the Bernie Sanders approach. You have legislation introduced in the last Congress on Medicare buy-in for those who reach age 55. We've been working on yet another variation and another piece of the spectrum, which would be a Medicare buy-in for first responders who reach age 55, because as we know, firefighters and police always have a gap where they're retiring in their 50s and they're not reaching the Medicare eligibility age of 65 for some period of time. And municipalities are pulling back on their retiree health. So that is going to be an interesting area. I will say Sherrod Brown of Ohio is putting a lot of work into it. The Ohio Police and Fire Pension Fund, the IAF, FOP are all very engaged. So that'll be interesting to see.
Great, thank you, Tony. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about some of the more negative proposals that may or may not come up. But let me turn it over to Andrew. Are there, at the state level, Andrew, are you aware of any opportunities for more offensive legislation introduction for public pensions or public employees?
Absolutely, and it's great to finally talk about going on the offensive. There's several states throughout the U.S. that have not given COLAs to public employee retirees in upwards of a decade or more. And I think there's a good opportunity for our coalitions that we fund to really push for those COLAs for retirees. as the price of inflation has increased, and the price of milk and butter and everything else that families look to buy increases, their pay or their benefit has stayed the same. And I think it's time that a lot of those states look at increasing that COLA. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. COLAs, are there any other opportunities for, for states that have gone from defined contribution? Are there any opportunities for legislation to be introduced to go back to a defined benefit? Do you see any opportunities in 2019?
Not so much in 2019. I think it's more of a long-term approach. I would love, and our organization would love, for these states to move back. And I think some of these states might be forced to at a certain point because their funding levels have gone so low. But we'll see what happens and what state legislatures look to do this year. But I think COLAs are the main focus right now.
Okay, so that's what NPPC is going to be focusing on in 2019.
Sure.
Great. So Tony, going back to the federal government, you started off with a couple of more positive developments. Are there others that you can highlight, or are there things that we should be looking out for that may be less positive?
Certainly there's one other on the offensive agenda that I should mention, and that is in the law today in the tax code. Again, it's first responders can exclude from their gross income up to $3,000 their pension distribution if it is used for health care premium. And that was done in the 2006 Pension Protection Act. The $3,000 cap has not been revisited in now, 13 years. And it's never been indexed. So we think looking at this provision for those two items, also it's not eligible for surviving spouse. There are structural questions about that exclusion and whether it should be a deduction. And further, there are some innovative designs on retiree health care that are kind of coming into the fore where there is in that provision a direct payment rule. And plans I know are looking at having an intermediary, say a health reimbursement arrangement, catch the dollars from the pension plan and then spend the dollars on premiums. So that is an area that I think we should absolutely look at. Defense. It's always fun to play offense, but you've got to make sure that you're not getting hurt. So the two principal proposals in the past Congress, and one that goes back to 2011, PEPTA, so the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act. I'll start with that. That's been introduced since 2011 by Congressman Devin Nunes of California, a Republican, and the second most senior Republican on the Ways and Means Committee today. So a member who certainly can get attention when the Republicans are devising their alternatives to the majority's proposals. In the past, PEPTA has been introduced in the Senate, first by Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina, who hasn't shown a great interest in it recently, but then by Senator Orrin Hatch, who retired. So we will see if PEPTA is picked up by another member in the Senate. I would suspect that Congressman Nunes will continue his advocacy of that provision. And the other provision that was a serious threat to public plans is the application of the unrelated business income tax, or UBIT, to investments of state and local plans. As we know, that passed the House in 2017.
Yep.
That was the 2017 bill. Without much, we were not, I'd say, late to the party, but that bill was moved so quickly after it was announced that I don't think many provisions were changed at all. I think we got the attention of the House leadership on it, certainly. NCPERS led the way on that. We prevented it from being in the Senate bill, and it was not in the conference agreement that was signed into law. So UBIT, as a revenue raiser, we could see it again. A $1.1 billion revenue raiser over 10 years is not staggering, but it's still $1.1 billion. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So actually, since you raised it, Tony, what do you think here in DC, has the culture changed relative to deficit spending and pay-go? I know the Democratic majority in the House, when they came in, one of the things they talked about was reinstituting pay-go, particularly after the Tax Reform Act of 2017. But, I mean, realistically, what do you think?
I think that the Democrats are probably not going to have as their number one priority balancing the budget. And I've been told that by Democrats, senior Democrats, who have said, don't think we're going to come into the majority and we're going to turn the deficit around. I mean, we're going to pay more attention to it, I think, than the Republicans have recently, because the Republicans have been very much of this mindset of stimulus. We're gonna cut taxes to the bone, and the money's going to flow. And that the proof is still in the pudding on that. Yeah. So we still need to see the evidence of it. I don't expect a huge change, but I do expect that any new tax cuts, for instance, would be offset. And that leads to a discussion that we could have on which, Andrew's folks feel the state and local, the SALT deduction, yeah. So the federal deductibility of state and local taxes. And I would think that would be examined pretty closely by the new House majority, and that legislation would be advanced to, so right now you have a $10,000 per return cap, that would be increased and maybe offset somehow, but I don't know how that somehow is defined yet.
Before I turn it over to Andrew to give us sort of his final summations and other issues relative to the state and local arena, I do want to again ask folks or remind folks to submit questions via the GoToMeetings portal. So we're near the end of the program, and we'd like to get your input and questions to our panelists. And also one small commercial relative to the NCPERS Legislative Conference, which is going to be coming up in about 2 to 3 weeks at the end of January. All the issues that we're talking about, particularly the ones here at the in Washington, D.C. and at the federal level, we will be covering at the Legislative Conference on Monday. And then on Tuesday, we will have a revamped policy day where we take the learning that we had the day before and implement it by lobbying your members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, on that Tuesday. So hopefully this is sort of a warm-up for you, and that you will be joining us later in this month. So after that brief break for commercial, Andrew, any final thoughts relative to states? Anything else we should be looking forward to or keeping an eye on?
For sure. I think as we look towards 2019, we should really focus on how pensions affect local economies. And you have billions of dollars being paid out in benefits each year to retirees, and they're going and spending that in their local communities, at their barbershops, their local restaurants. So I think as we look towards messaging, I think that's a great place to start. And speaking of messaging, we're releasing a toolkit coming up here shortly that talks about how to communicate best about pensions. So be on the lookout for that. There's all sorts of information in there, and I think it would be useful for everyone to take a look at.
Great. And for folks who may want to get more information about NPPC or forming a coalition or finding out about the state coalition that NPPC is funding, what's the best website or email address?
You can just visit our website, protectpensions.org, and follow the links from there and contact us, and we'll be back in touch.
Great. All right, Tony. Last words regarding issues at the federal level. Anything relative to Social Security, Medicare?
So there was, Social Security is worth mentioning, absolutely. There was quite an effort by Ways and Means Chairman Brady, who's now the senior Republican in the minority, and the member he flipped with, that would be Congressman Richie Neal of Massachusetts, who's the now chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, on WEP. And that's the windfall elimination provision, one of the Social Security offsets that hits public employees if they've earned a pension from non-covered Social Security work, such as their public service. I would expect now Chairman Neal to continue that effort. And there are folks that we're going to be visiting with in the lobby day on Congressman Neal's staff that we're going to talk to about this, and I feel as if he has more potentially an ear to the ground on some of the concerns that have been raised, and maybe more of a willingness to bridge those concerns going forward. So I think I would look for WEP legislation. You know, we've always been concerned about mandatory Social Security. I don't see that as a real threat. But again, when you look at putting together larger bills, sometimes these pay-fors, if you could call that a pay-for, because there are going to be new benefits being paid if you did that, then I think you have to keep it on the table for something to keep an eye on.
So, you know, relative to former Chairman Brady's WEP bill, part of the reason why that collapsed was because, again, he wanted to keep it revenue neutral. And so, again, post the 2017 tax reform, where seemingly, you know, budgets don't matter, are there conversations about whether this new effort, probably led by Chairman Neal, would that be revenue neutral? Or are they trying to make it revenue neutral? Or
they actually moved in their last proposal off revenue neutrality.
Okay.
So some of the provisions that the chairman had in to keep it revenue neutral disappeared. And I would suspect that that's going to continue to be the case. That I do not think WEP reform or repeal, however you want to label it, because it would be repeal for younger folks, is going to be revenue neutral. I think that should facilitate, as I said before, bridging the gap on some of the differences that have come up.
Okay. Great. So it seems like we got a number of questions. So let me read the first one to you. Do you see opportunities for getting a parameters bill for reformed national pension policy?
You know, it's a very, very interesting question. And part of what we do is we like to throw the ball back into Andrew's direction. At the federal level, we are very fond of saying, please don't do a one-size-fits-all policy. At the national level, that would affect state and local plans. Let those battles be waged wherever they're going to be waged, you know, in the state capitals and in the municipalities, in the city councils. So, however, saying that, we do look very closely at things that are being worked on in Washington, like this multi-employer pension proposal. And if Congress is able to come together on a multi-employer pension, I'm not going to use the word bailout, but I just did, some other type of financial assistance to be provided these plans, I think it could be a template in the future if public plans, which we don't foresee in any way, were to seek federal assistance. But I don't see a national pension plan being developed in Congress that would affect state and local plans.
Okay. Andrew, I think the next question is for you. Okay. What do you think is the best thing for Kentucky lawmakers to do in their state's underfunded pension plans?
That's a great question. I think the best thing that they can do is fully fund their plans. Any sort of plan design changes that are being thrown around are only going to hurt the plans in the long run. To Governor Bevin's credit, during the last budget session, he actually fully funded the plans for the first time in years. And we saw the teachers' plan in that state actually increase their funding for the first time in a while, which was great to see. So fully funding works, and I think that's what Kentucky lawmakers should focus on. Yep. When you have public employees that have contributed each and every paycheck to their public pension plans, meanwhile the state deferred or skipped or paid partially into their plans each and every year, it comes down to the state having to take responsibility and pay their bills, and I think that's where Kentucky needs to go.
And I will say, just to underscore your point, as you know, at NCPERS, we do an annual survey of public retirement systems, and the 2019 edition of that report will be coming out in the next week or so. So I don't have the most recent data relative to 2018, but what I can say is, for the study that we did last year, 2018, using 2017 data, 74% of respondents reported that their plan sponsor made the full actuarially determined contribution, which was a 4% increase from the year before. So I think hopefully more plan sponsors are recognizing that these payments are not something that can be always kicked down the road, that an obligation to fund these plans is a hard obligation. So hopefully, I think that's a good comment. I think this one is for you again, Andrew.
Okay.
How have states' budgets been affected by legislatures moving newly hired public employees into hybrid or 401k plans?
For sure. I think in terms of how states are affected by these types of moves, we often hark back to West Virginia. In 1991, West Virginia lawmakers closed their public pension plan for teachers. And only 14 years later was the plan reduced to about 25% funding. And at that point then, Governor Joe Manchin decided to do a study on what the best way to overcome their difficulties was. And ultimately, they opened back up the plan, not only for future employees, but current employees as well. And now they sit at a pretty well-funded status in the state. So I think in terms of budgets, it's best for you to just fully fund your plans. Not to go back to that again, but full funding matters. Making drastic plan changes only hurts you in the long run.
Tony, next question. Do you think any significant tax legislation will be enacted in the 116th Congress?
I mean, I think significant is possible in as much as there are provisions in the 2017 bill that need correcting.
Yeah.
So you could term those as significant. The other area that I could see it is potentially retirement. Back to retirement, right? There were so many proposals on the table at the end of the 115th Congress. And new Chairman Neal at Ways and Means has always been interested in retirement savings and enhancing retirement savings. He has very competent staff who we work with very closely. So I could see bipartisanship developing around retirement policy. There's going to be a lot of messaging, though. If you go back to SALT, the SALT deduction, there are going to be a lot of pieces of legislation that the Ways and Means Committee pumps out, and probably across the House floor, that are more for political messaging purposes. Okay. They will know that the votes aren't there in the Senate. They will implore the Senate to enact this legislation passed by the House, but we really understand those bills to be more in a messaging vein.
Okay. Before I read the next question, I'm going to put both of you on notice. Before we close out, I'd like to have predictions from you. One prediction for July when we do the semi-annual end of legislation calendar webcast. So think about that. And the next question is, should and can the Democratic House be pushed into outline in legislation bipartisan parameters?
I'm trying to think of use the word parameters of the question.
Yeah.
And I think it's similar to the question I answered earlier.
My guess is this is a follow-up to that question.
Which is, should we press it? I don't think so. I mean, my reaction to this always is let the states and localities deal with the hard decisions on their pension plans, and not ask Congress to provide some one-size-fits-all solution, which is not going to work. It's not going to work for everybody, and it's going to leave folks extraordinarily, I think, unhappy to be imposed upon by the federal government.
All right, so there is another question. So you have a few more minutes to think about your prediction. What is NCPERS' position on a bill by Representative Baden from Texas to prohibit federal government to bail out state pensions. So we haven't taken a position on such a proposal. I think without further study and in a vacuum, I think generally we are opposed to any sort of federal involvement of state and local pension plans relative to, quote, bailout, unquote. I think the general statement would be that we would be very critical and look at a proposal very critically and need to see the details of it before we make any definitive statements, largely because I think federal, again, quote, bailouts come with many hooks and requirements that I think are very onerous and burdensome. So without knowing further and without studying the legislation, I think we would look at it very critically. So, Andrew, you've had some time to think about a prediction. What do you predict that will be an item that you want to feature when we talk about this again in July?
For sure, and let me put away my crystal ball for that time. I honestly think that upwards of 3 different states are going to pass COLAs this year, which would be great relief for public sector retirees in those states, whether they're firefighters, police officers, or teachers. I honestly think that Kentucky is not going to pass the pension bill, the plan changes that they would like to. There's a lot of opposition in that state to do so. And I think that's it for now. Okay. That's the only predictions I'm going to make.
You gave us one more extra, so okay,
yeah, I did.
Good.
I did.
Tony?
These predictions are always fraught with peril, right? Yeah. No, I'm going to do an optimistic prediction, and I think the House Democrats are going to want to show that they are so different than the House Republican majority that they will pass individually each of the 12 appropriations bills by early spring.
Oh, okay.
That's looking forward. They still have to deal with the current shutdown on this year's fiscal year, but I think they're going to move very quickly and draw that very distinct difference.
Wow, regular order. That hasn't been done in I don't know how many years.
A long time, a very long time.
Okay, well, bold prediction. I like it. Andrew Collier, Tony Roda, thank you so much. I thought this was a great session. I thought we had a great conversation, and I think our audience members learned a lot. Right. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have another webinar in February, and stay tuned for our July webcast where we do a summation of what happened in the first half of 2019, and we'll see whether these predictions have come true. Thank you so much.